The Monroe County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning smells exactly the way you'd expect a building that processes human misery to smell floor wax laid over something older. The particular staleness of recycled air that has absorbed 1,000 quiet conversations about bail amounts and sentencing guidelines, and what happens next. The fluorescent lights overhead hum at a frequency that sits just below conscious notice, drilling into the back of your skull after about 20 minutes. The linoleum is the color of old mustard. Nobody chose it. It has simply always been there. Officer Marcus Doyle pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B and stepped into that hallway feeling, as he almost always did, like a man who owned the building. His utility belt creaked with each step. His thumbs were hooked in his vest. He had just finished testifying in a drug possession case, and the judge had believed every word he said, which was the expected outcome, because the judge always believed him, because men like Doyle have spent 15 years learning exactly how to be believed. He saw the woman on the bench almost immediately. Black woman, late 40s, beige trench coat over a dark turtleneck. A leather portfolio open on her lap, reading something dense and serious. She was not blocking anything. She was not making noise. She was simply sitting in the space she was entitled to sit in, doing work that was none of his business. None of that mattered. He told her to move. She looked up at him with eyes that did not contain a single molecule of fear. And that was the thing that lit him up from the inside. Not defiance, not anger. Just the specific, devastating calm of a woman who was not impressed. He kicked her, hard, steel-toed boot full weight behind it. He gave her his badge number with a smirk. Badge 4417, Officer Marcus Doyle. File a complaint, sweetheart. He walked away laughing. What he did not know, could not have known, because nothing in his life had ever prepared him for the possibility, was that the woman picking his papers up off that linoleum floor was not going to the complaint desk. She was going to the mayor's office, and she wasn't filing a report. She was accepting a job. The next time Marcus Doyle saw that woman, she was standing at a podium inside his own precinct, and she was wearing 4 stars. Marcus Doyle had been with the Hargrove City Police Department for 15 years, and if you asked anyone who knew him well enough to be honest about it, they would tell you that not a single one of those years had made him a better person. He was 43 years old, white barrel-chested, in the way that comes from a lifetime of believing you don't have to move for anyone with a red, weathered face that had settled permanently into an expression of mild contempt for everything around him. He was not decorated for bravery. He was not known for solving cases or building community trust or any of the things that departments put in their mission statements. He was known for his arrest numbers, which looked impressive on a spreadsheet and told you absolutely nothing about whether those arrests were just. In the break room, the other officers called him old school, which was a polite way of saying something they were not willing to say directly. On the streets of the East Side, the residents who dealt with him used a different vocabulary, but only after his cruiser had turned the corner. His philosophy was simple and completely wrong. Fear was respect, and the badge was permission. He had operated under this philosophy for so long that it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the natural order of things, the way gravity feels like the natural order of things. You don't question it, you just fall. He had 11 use of force complaints in his personnel file. Not one of them had resulted in any disciplinary action because Captain Raymond Birch ran the Internal Affairs Division, and Raymond Birch and Marcus Doyle had been playing golf together on alternate Sundays for 9 years. Birch was heavy-set with a permanently loosened tie and the practiced calm of a man who has made a career out of making problems disappear before they became problems. He and Doyle had an arrangement. The arrangement worked because nobody with the power to stop it had ever tried hard enough to stop it. Doyle did not think of himself as corrupt. He thought of himself as effective. This distinction mattered enormously to him and to no one else. He had been in a particularly good mood that morning, which was the kind of detail that would have seemed irrelevant at the time and would later feel significant. He had testified in a minor drug possession case involving a young man from the Riverside district, and the testimony he had given was not entirely true. The probable cause he described had been constructed after the fact, which was a thing he had done enough times that he had stopped experiencing it as dishonesty and had started experiencing it as craft. The judge had not pushed back. The judge never pushed back. He stepped into the hallway still carrying that specific high, the particular lightness that comes from being believed completely when you should not have been. The corridor was packed in the way courthouse hallways always are, around mid-morning public defenders moving fast with too many files, nervous defendants in clothes they borrowed for the occasion, families sitting on hard benches with the special exhaustion of people waiting for something they cannot control. Doyle hated crowds not for the noise or the press of bodies, but because crowds contained people who did not automatically get out of his way, and having to navigate around civilians felt to him like a small indignity he should not have to absorb. He saw the line from traffic court blocking his direct path to the clerk's office. He saw the woman on the bench sitting squarely in his trajectory. And something in him, the part that had been running unopposed for 15 years, made a decision before his brain had fully processed that he was making one. She looked like someone who needed to be reminded of something. He was going to remind her. Vanessa Carr had been awake since 4 in the morning. This was not unusual. She had been waking at 4 in the morning for most of her adult life, usually with a specific problem already assembled in her mind as though her brain had been working on it through the night, and was simply waiting for the rest of her to catch up. This morning, the problem was a departmental budget document that someone in Hargrove City's finance office had clearly hoped nobody would read carefully, because buried in the overtime columns were expenditure lines that did not correspond to any documented operation, and buried in the tactical equipment requests were approvals for gear that had never appeared in any inventory log. She was 49 years old, and she was reading that document on a courthouse bench in a beige trench coat over a dark turtleneck and tailored slacks with a leather portfolio on her lap, and the quiet, absolute focus of someone who has learned to do her best thinking in the middle of noise. 22 years in law enforcement across 3 cities. She had started as a patrol officer in a department that did not know what to do with her, and had risen through a combination of performance that was impossible to ignore and a stubborn refusal to disappear to deputy superintendent in Chicago over 14 years. She had a law degree she had completed at night while working full-time, 1 class at a time, over 6 years, reading case law on her lunch breaks and writing papers at her kitchen table after her children were asleep. Her father had been a patrol officer for 19 years. He had been passed over for promotion 7 times, not because he was unqualified, because the record showed he was exceptionally qualified, but because the culture of his department in 1980s Baltimore did not make room for men like him. He had worn the uniform with a dignity it did not always deserve, and he had never complained about this in front of his children. And Vanessa had spent most of her career carrying the weight of that silence as motivation. She had come to Hargrove because Mayor Gerald Whitmore had called the department an institution on the edge of collapse, and those words, that specific combination, had felt less like a job description and more like a problem worth solving. She was not here as an outsider passing through. She was already working. The budget document on her lap was the 3rd departmental file she had reviewed since dawn. She had exactly the number of patients for bureaucratic theater as was required to do the job, which is to say, enough to function and not a molecule more. She heard him before she saw him, the particular thud of boots that belong to someone who has decided they don't need to accommodate the space they're in. She looked up and clocked the badge first, then the face, then the posture, and in approximately 2 seconds she had read everything about Marcus Doyle that was worth knowing. Her feet were tucked neatly against the bench legs. She was not blocking anything. She told him this calmly, factually, the way you state a thing that is simply true. The calm was the wrong response as far as Doyle was concerned. He had expected either deference or defensiveness, and she offered neither, and the absence of what he expected felt to him like a challenge, so he escalated, his voice dropping into that particular register of condescension that men practice without knowing they're practicing it, the one that wraps contempt in the language of instruction. People like you always think the rules don't apply. The racial subtext was not subtle. Several people in the hallway heard it and looked away. She stated again that she was waiting for her number to be called and that she had a right to sit where she was sitting. He kicked her. Not a tap, not a brush. A deliberate full-weight impact of a steel-toed boot against her right shin, the kind of blow that makes a sound people nearby remember afterward. Her portfolio flew off her lap. Hundreds of pages of departmental files, budget audits, use of force logs, internal affairs, correspondence, scattered across the linoleum in a wide, chaotic slide. A woman nearby gasped. A public defender stopped walking, looked at the scene, and then kept walking because this was Hargrove, and Marcus Doyle was a known quantity. He looked down at her on the floor and said something about her having a reason to be there now. He laughed. The laugh was genuine, which was the worst thing about it. Vanessa did not cry. She did not scream. She began collecting her papers with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, one page at a time, organized as she picked them up, her face completely still. The bruise was forming against her shin. She could feel it clearly, a deep and spreading ache, and she filed it away the same way she filed everything as information. When she had her papers, she looked up at him from the floor and asked for his name and badge number. Her voice was 10 degrees colder than it had been before, and it carried in it a quality that Doyle was too arrogant to recognize as something he should be afraid of. He gave her the information proudly. Badge 4-417, Officer Marcus Doyle. He told her to file a complaint and let him know how it worked out for her. He stepped over her scattered papers. A dirty boot print landed squarely on the page that listed the department's proposed new chain of command and walked away down the hallway, still laughing, feeling completely in control of a situation he had already lost entirely. At least 9 people saw what happened. A public defender with a stack of files under his arm stopped walking when the sound reached him, looked at the scene for 2 full seconds, then continued toward his courtroom. Because there were things in Hargrove you weighed before you inserted yourself into them, and Marcus Doyle's name was at the top of that list. A young woman with a toddler on her hip turned her face away. A court clerk at the far end of the hall suddenly found her phone extremely interesting. Nobody intervened. And this was not cowardice in the simple sense, it was learned survival. The specific knowledge of what happens in a city like Hargrove when you speak up against someone like Doyle. You become a problem. Your car gets ticketed more often. Your brother's case somehow gets more complicated. The math of retaliation is not complicated, and everyone in that hallway had already done it. There was one exception. An older black man in his 60s, sitting 3 benches down, watched the entire thing from beginning to end without looking away. When Doyle had gone and Vanessa was standing again, the older man caught her eye for just a moment. His expression was not pity. It was recognition, the specific look of someone who has been on that floor in 100 different ways over a long life, who has been told with a kick or a dismissal or a form letter that they did not belong in the space they occupied. He nodded barely just once and then looked back at his paperwork. Vanessa held that for a moment before she walked away. She stacked her papers with absolute precision, tapping the edges square against her portfolio, the way someone does when the order of things is the only thing they can control. The bruise was throbbing with a deep, pulsing ache that she had no intention of acknowledging in public in front of anyone in this building. She stood, brushed off her slacks, and took stock. She was not going to the clerk's office anymore. The number she had been waiting for no longer mattered. She had seen in 4 minutes more of the Hargrove City Police Department's institutional culture than she could have gotten from a week of reading reports, and what she had seen was sufficient. She pulled out her phone and called Mayor Gerald Whitmore's private cell. The conversation was brief and carefully calibrated. She confirmed she was in town. She confirmed she was ready for the afternoon announcement. She told him in a tone that made it clear the statement was not a question or a suggestion that she would be making some immediate changes to the roster. She did not explain why. She ended the call, tucked the phone into her coat pocket, and walked toward the courthouse exit. The reader still does not know exactly what job she is walking toward, but the woman who just took Doyle's badge number does. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the Hargrove City Police Department's locker room had the particular chaotic energy of a shift change, lockers banging open and shut, radios cutting in and out with bursts of static, the low-level smell of coffee that had been on the burner for too long, mixing with cheap deodorant and the specific staleness that accumulates in a room where people change clothes and say things they wouldn't say in front of cameras. Marcus Doyle was sitting on the center bench, unlacing his tactical boots with the comfortable ease of a man who considers himself the most important person in any room he enters. Around him, in the loose orbit that powerful men always generate, were two younger officers. Officer Tommy Weston was 27 years old, 1 year out of the academy, and he had the eager, slightly too attentive quality of a person who is working very hard to be liked by someone they have correctly identified as dominant in the room. He laughed at Doyle's jokes about 2 seconds after everyone else because he was always checking first to make sure they were supposed to be funny. Officer Derek Paulson was 34, quieter, carrying the slightly hunched posture of a man who knows he is doing something he shouldn't but has been doing it long enough that extraction feels impossible. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had made a series of small accommodations over 3 years that had added up to something he didn't entirely recognize anymore. Doyle was retelling the courthouse story. In his version, it was a story about a woman who didn't know her place and a cop who corrected the situation efficiently and moved on. He described her asking for his badge number like it was the punchline to the whole thing. Weston laughed right on cue. Paulson looked at his boots. "Nothing sticks to me," Doyle said, slamming his locker shut with a sound that punctuated the sentence. "Birch runs internal affairs. We play golf. That's how this city works, kid. We don't bow to the public bows to us. That's the job." Tommy Weston nodded like he was writing it down somewhere inside himself. Paulson said nothing. The intercom on the wall crackled, cutting into the tail end of Doyle's sermon. All personnel to the main assembly room. 30 minutes. Mandatory attendance. Introduction of the new chief of police. Doyle rolled his eyes. He told Weston it was the same routine it always was, another outsider, hired for political optics who would make speeches for 6 months and then learn to leave things alone. He had outlasted 2 chiefs already. He would outlast this one. On the wall near the door, a photograph of the outgoing chief was half removed. One piece of tape still holding up the left corner, the right side peeling away from the concrete. Nobody had finished taking it down. Nobody wanted to be the one to do it. Doyle walked past it without noticing. At the same time, several floors above the locker room, the chief's office door was locked from the inside. Vanessa Carr sat behind the mahogany desk and rolled up the right leg of her trousers. The bruise had deepened since the courthouse. Dark purple spreading the center still showed the exact shape of a boot toe, unmistakable, like evidence under a lab light. She pressed 2 fingers against it. The pain was immediate and honest. She held it for exactly 5 seconds and let herself feel it completely, because she had learned long ago that suppressed pain finds other ways out, and she had no room for that. She thought about her father, 19 years in uniform. 7 denied promotions. A man who never once let any of his children see him break down about what was done to him, which meant she had grown up understanding injustice as a thing you absorbed quietly and then worked around. She was done working around. She was here to work through. She pulled the trouser leg back down, smoothed the crease, and pressed the intercom. "Send in Detective Reyes." Detective Lucia Reyes was 38 years old, and she had the highest homicide clearance rate in the Hargrove Department's history and had been passed over for promotion 3 times. The most recent time, the position went to a man she had personally trained over 18 months, a man who had been on the force for 6 years to her 12. She walked in cautiously, the way someone walks into a room when they've been burned enough times by rooms that looked promising. Vanessa had read her file twice. She had also read the 3 promotion denial letters, each of which was written in the specific bureaucratic language that means we are not going to explain this and we are counting on you not to push. Vanessa offered her a seat and did not waste time. She named Doyle directly. She laid out the parameters, a covert internal audit completely off the books built entirely outside Internal Affairs' chain of access, because Internal Affairs was Captain Raymond Birch's kingdom, and Raymond Birch was part of the problem. Reyes asked the obvious question. If they find out before we're ready, what then? Vanessa's answer was measured and final. If I fire him today, Birch buries the complaint, the union wins the appeal in 6 months, and Owen Grady is still paying the tax in a year. I don't want his badge. I want his future. Reyes sat with that for a moment. Then she squared her shoulders in the small, definitive way of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door to open. She was in. The main assembly room of the Hargrove City Police Department held 114 people comfortably, and today held closer to 120, which meant some of the officers in the back were standing against the wall with their arms crossed, in the specific posture of people who have decided in advance not to be impressed by anything they are about to hear. Marcus Doyle was in the second row, already scrolling his phone under the edge of the seat in front of him, and the verdict he had internally rendered before anyone said a word was simple. This would not change anything meaningful. The new chief would understand within a few months how the 3rd District actually ran, and life would return to its normal shape. He had been through this twice. He knew the arc. Mayor Gerald Whitmore was at the podium, a compact, careful man in his mid-50s who had bet his re-election on this hire and was carrying the weight of that bet visibly in the tension around his jaw. He was not reading from notes. He spoke slowly, deliberately, building the introduction the way you build something you need to hold weight. 22 years in law enforcement, patrol officer to deputy superintendent, a law degree. A record of disciplinary action against misconduct that was by any measurable standard the most aggressive of any administrator in the state over the past decade. The room shifted not dramatically, not all at once, but the way temperature shifts when you open a window in a closed space. Officers who had been leaning back straightened slightly. The posture of the room became less certain of itself. Doyle leaned over to Weston. Same song. She'll last a year. Weston nodded with slightly less conviction than he'd had 20 minutes ago. Your new chief of police, Vanessa Carr. The side doors opened. The entire room stood protocol automatic, 120 people rising together in the shuffle of boots and the creak of chairs, and Doyle stood too bored, his hands coming together in the beginning of a polite, dismissive clap. First clap, second clap. On the third clap, his hands stopped. They stopped mid-motion, approximately 8 inches apart, and hung there in the air as though the signal from his brain to continue the motion had been interrupted by something more urgent. Because his brain was in that moment processing something that his eyes had delivered 3 seconds earlier, and that had taken 3 seconds to fully resolve into meaning. The beige trench coat was gone. The navy turtleneck was gone. The leather portfolio was gone. But the face, the sharp, precise jawline, the steady dark eyes, the expression that did not shift or soften or perform in any direction was absolutely identical to the face that had looked up at him from the courthouse floor 6 hours ago and asked without any fear at all for his badge number. The woman he had kicked was walking to the podium in 4 silver stars and a gold shield. His hands hung in the air. The third clap never came. The sound of the room, the ambient noise of 120 people shifting and settling, seemed to drain away from his immediate vicinity. The man next to him, a detective named Garland, who had never particularly liked Doyle, glanced over and noticed the expression on his face and then looked deliberately away. The blood left Doyle's face the way color leaves a photograph left in the sun, not all at once but in a rapid, visible fade that started at his forehead and reached his jaw before he had time to stop it. Chief Vanessa Carr reached the podium. She did not look at her notes. She did not look at the mayor. She looked at the room slowly, deliberately scanning the sea of uniforms with a calm that was not the calm of indifference, but the calm of someone who has already decided what needs to happen and is simply taking stock of the terrain. Her gaze moved through the room methodically, past the detectives near the windows, past the lieutenants in the center, past the rookies in the back. And then it arrived at the second row, and it stopped. She found Marcus Doyle. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. No expression of triumph, no coldness meant to intimidate, no smile. Nothing performed, just the look of a person who already knows the outcome of a situation you don't yet know you're in. It was the most terrifying thing Doyle had ever experienced from someone standing perfectly still. Then she turned to the microphone. "My name is Vanessa Carr, and as of this moment, everything you thought you knew about how this department operates is over." The meeting ended, and the room cleared in a subdued, slightly stunned silence that was nothing like the usual post-briefing noise. No complaints about new policy, no jokes at the back, just the quiet scuffle of a department that was trying to recalibrate something without knowing yet what the new numbers were. Doyle stayed in his chair. His hands were on his knees. They were shaking. Not visibly if you weren't looking for it, but enough that he could feel it, the fine tremor of a man whose body has understood something before his mind is ready to process it. He waited until the room was nearly empty, then moved not toward the locker room, not toward the exit, but straight up the back stairwell to the 3rd floor, to the Internal Affairs Division, to the corner office of Captain Raymond Birch. He told Birch everything: the hallway, the kick, the papers, the badge number he had volunteered with a grin. Birch's face went through 3 distinct expressions: shock, calculation, and then the practiced steadiness of a man who has been making problems disappear for 9 years and believes he can make this one disappear too. His advice was measured: keep your head down, stay by the book. If she files anything formal, it has to come across my desk. I control the docket, I can tie it up for months. But you cannot give her a reason to go around me, not one. Doyle nodded by the book. Yeah, okay. He believed this would work. He believed it because he had always believed it, and it had always worked, and nothing in 15 years had taught him to update that belief. He did not know, had no framework for knowing that Vanessa Carr had spent 22 years studying exactly how men like Birch protect men like Doyle, and exactly how to move around them without making a sound. Day 1 after the announcement, nothing. Doyle checked his locker when he arrived. Nothing. He avoided the 4th floor with the specific, studied casualness of a man trying very hard to look like he is not avoiding something. He completed his shift by the book, no detours, no collection runs camera on the entire time, and drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. Day 3, nothing. Day 5. Birch pulled him aside in the hallway and said with the smile of a man who believes he is still in control of a situation that the new chief was buried in city council meetings and budget reviews and had not made any inquiry about the courthouse incident through any official channel. Day 8, Doyle's shoulders came down from where they'd been living just below his ears. By day 12, the arrogance was back. Not all at once, it never comes back all at once in a man like Doyle, but in the incremental, almost invisible way that confidence reasserts itself when a threat doesn't materialize on the schedule your nervous system expected. He started telling the courthouse story again in the break room to different audiences, this time with slightly more embellishment. By day 14, he had constructed a complete internal narrative that satisfied him entirely. She was scared of the union. She understood that the 3rd District ran on relationships that predated her arrival by a decade. She was smart enough to know she couldn't touch him without burning down something she needed. Hargrove is still mine, he told himself, strapping on his vest for a Tuesday evening shift. She knows it. He was wrong about every single part of this. While Doyle was rebuilding his confidence in the break room, Vanessa Carr and Detective Lucia Reyes were doing something that left no fingerprints in any system Birch could access. Vanessa had called in a favor from her years in Chicago. Agent Carl Desmond, FBI Public Corruption Task Force. Mid-50s, a man with a gray temple stillness that came from 2 decades of watching powerful men underestimate the people they'd wronged. Desmond and Vanessa had worked a joint operation 3 years prior that had resulted in the conviction of a city comptroller and 2 aldermen. He trusted her completely, which was not a thing he said about many people. Together, they secured a Title III federal wiretap warrant signed by a federal magistrate, bypassing every layer of local jurisdiction. bypassing Birch's desk, entirely operating in a legal space that Raymond Birch did not have clearance to see, let alone touch. Reyes, working alone in a borrowed office 2 floors below the chief's suite, pulled every arrest report Doyle had filed in 5 years and cross-referenced the resisting arrest charges against emergency room admission records at 2 nearby hospitals. The pattern that emerged was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that appears when someone has been doing the same thing for long enough that they have stopped being careful about it. She identified Owen Grady, 58 years old, white owner of Grady's Muffler and Brake on the East Industrial Strip, a man who had been running his father's shop for 31 years and paying Marcus Doyle's personal tax for 3 of them. $600 a month, cash, in a plain envelope, in exchange for Doyle not calling city inspectors to cite him for violations that Doyle would invent on the spot if Grady stopped paying. Reyes made contact with Grady carefully off any record at a diner 2 miles from the shop. He was a quiet man who had the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a wrong for a long time without being able to put it down. When Reyes explained what she needed, he was silent for a long moment. Then, he said yes. He had been waiting for someone to actually show up and ask. The equipment went into the shop on a Thursday night, a 4K camera inside a smoke detector above the lift bay, a parabolic microphone buried in a stack of old brake rotors, and by the following Tuesday, everything was ready. It was a Tuesday evening when Marcus Doyle decided that the 2-week pause in his monthly collection from Owen Grady had gone on long enough, and that the appropriate response to a new chief of police was to demonstrate to himself through action that nothing had actually changed. He was in the cruiser with Tommy Weston, who was driving because Weston always drove when Doyle was in the passenger seat, because that was the arrangement that existed between them without either of them ever making it explicit. The radio was low, the shift was quiet, and Doyle was in the specific good mood of a man who has talked himself back into believing he is invincible. He told Weston they were making a stop at Grady's shop, proactive community engagement he called it, with the tone of someone who has said a phrase so many times it has lost all connection to its original irony. Weston's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. They didn't have a call out there. He said so, carefully phrasing it as an observation rather than an objection, because he had learned that objections were not welcome in Marcus Doyle's passenger seat. Doyle told him to relax and turn on the radio. When they pulled around to the back of the shop out of sight of the main road, which was always where Doyle liked to park for these visits, Doyle reached up to his chest and pressed the button on his body camera. A small beep. The red light went dark. "Turn yours off." Weston turned to look at him. "Chief Carr's new policy says technical malfunction," Doyle said flatly, with the absolute absence of room for discussion that he had perfected over 15 years. "It happens. Turn it off." Tommy Weston's hand went to his camera. It hovered there for a full 3 seconds, the weight of 27 years of conscience pressing against 18 months of conditioning in the other direction. Then he turned it off. His hand wasn't steady when he did it. He noticed that about himself. He didn't say anything. The shop smelled like motor oil and metal dust, and the particular grease of work that has been done for decades in the same space, and Owen Grady was wiping his hands on a rag near a lifted pickup when he heard the footsteps and looked up, and his shoulders fell in the specific way they always fell when he saw who it was. Doyle walked the perimeter of the shop, the way a man walks through a space he has decided is his, stopping to tap a tire. Here, glancing at an invoice pinned to the wall there, commenting on the inventory with a tone that was almost friendly and was therefore more frightening than an outright threat. He told Grady the envelope was late. Grady told him it was a hard month. His wife had been in the hospital, the insurance paperwork had consumed 2 weeks, the business was running behind. The shift in Doyle's face was not dramatic. It was simply the removal of the friendliness, replaced by something flat and deliberate. He stepped into Grady's space, grabbed him by the front of his coveralls, the fabric bunching in his fist, and shoved him hard against the side of the truck. The sound of Grady's back hitting the metal panel was loud in the quiet shop. "I don't give a damn about your wife," Doyle said, his voice low and even, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. You pay the tax or I shut you down. Have it by tomorrow night or I book you for resisting. Are we clear? He let go, smoothed the front of his uniform shirt, and walked back toward the cruiser, feeling again like himself. In the back office of Owen Grady's shop, behind a door marked Private No Entry, Detective Lucia Reyes was sitting in the dark in front of two monitors. One showed the 4K feed from the smoke detector above the lift bay, crystal clear, time-stamped, capturing the entire exchange from a downward angle that missed nothing. The second showed the audio waveform from the parabolic microphone, a clean, unbroken line that had recorded every word, including Doyle ordering Weston to disable his camera. Next to her, Agent Carl Desmond watched the playback with the expression of a man who has seen this before and is no less tired of it for that. Reyes pressed her secure radio. "Chief, we have it. All of it. The assault on Grady, the extortion demand, and him ordering the rookie to kill the camera." Miles away, Vanessa Carr was standing at her office window, looking at the city lights spread across the dark like a problem she was still working through. She said, "Let him sleep tonight. Tomorrow, we don't just spring the trap. We burn down the whole forest." Marcus Doyle drove home with the windows down because he was in a good mood, and men like him express good moods through small physical freedoms. He stopped at a drive-thru on Route 9 and ate in the parking lot, listening to a sports radio program argue about something he didn't particularly care about. And the normalcy of it, the absolute unchanged ordinariness of a Tuesday night, confirmed everything he had been telling himself for 2 weeks. He called his brother at 9:15 and complained briefly about the new chief's parking policy. She had reorganized the reserved spaces in the back lot and put his cruiser assignment 3 spots farther from the entrance than it used to be, which was minor and irrelevant, but the kind of thing Doyle treated as symbolic of a larger disrespect. He was asleep before 10. The money from Owen Grady wasn't in his pocket yet, but it would be by Wednesday night, and that was fine. It was always fine. He slept well. Tommy Weston was 27 years old, and he lay on his couch staring at the water stain on his apartment ceiling that he'd been meaning to report to the super for 4 months, and he was not sleeping. He had joined the force because his uncle was a cop. Retired, now still talked about the job like it was the most important thing a person could do with their life. And that had shaped Tommy's understanding of what a police uniform meant before he was old enough to examine it critically. He had wanted to matter. He had wanted to do something that mattered. 4 months on Doyle's shift had put 18 months worth of distance between him and that idea. He had turned off his camera 6 times. He had written 1 arrest report with details that were in the charitable construction incomplete. He had looked away from 3 interactions between Doyle and civilians that he could not describe now in terms he was comfortable with. Each time Doyle had made the calculation seem obvious. This is how it works. This is the job. This is how we keep order. And each time Tommy had made the small accommodation, and the accommodations had compounded the way interest compounds quietly and without permission until he was somewhere he didn't recognize. Tonight was different from the other nights. He knew Chief Carr's policy. He had read it twice. He knew what he had helped cover up. He knew that Owen Grady's wife had been in the hospital and that Grady had said so while being shoved against a truck, and that Doyle had told him he didn't care. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call Birch. He got up from the couch, went to his jacket pocket, pulled out the small notebook he carried for patrol notes, and opened it to the next blank page. He wrote the date at the top. Then he started writing, and he did not stop for a long time. The light in the chief's office on the 4th floor of the Hargrove City PD was still on at midnight, which was not unusual for Vanessa Carr, and which the night sergeant had already stopped remarking on after the 3rd consecutive evening. She was reading a case file, not Doyle's, not tonight, a complaint filed 2 years ago by a 23-year-old named Dante Harris Black, who had spent 4 days in the Hargrove County Detention Center on a charge that Marcus Doyle had constructed, and that a busy public defender had eventually gotten reduced to time served, but not before Harris lost the warehouse supervisor position he'd held for 18 months, a job that had taken him 8 months to find, and that came with health insurance he'd been paying into for the first time in his adult life. Harris had not filed a lawsuit. He had not filed a follow-up complaint. The file noted in a terse single line that he had declined further engagement with the complaint process, which was a bureaucratic way of saying that a young man had decided based on everything the system had shown him that there was no point. Vanessa wrote his name on a notepad and drew a single line beneath it. Tomorrow, the trap closed. But Dante Harris was the reason it had to. 7:45 in the morning, and Marcus Doyle walked into the Hargrove City PD carrying an iced coffee and the specific unhurried energy of a man who has decided that the thing he was afraid of is not actually coming. He was slightly warmer than usual to the people around him, backslapping a detective he barely knew, stopping to laugh too long at a joke from the front desk sergeant. And if you understood men like Doyle, you would understand that this warmth was not goodwill. It was the physical expression of relief, the way a person breathes differently in a room once they've decided the ceiling isn't going to fall. The administrative staff was quieter than usual. He did not notice. His coffee was halfway to his mouth when the PA came on. The voice on the PA was Detective Reyes' controlled, measured reading names with the specific cadence of a person who is about to irrevocably change the lives of the people she is naming: Captain Raymond Birch, Officer Marcus Doyle, Officer Tommy Weston, report to interview room A immediately. This is not a request. The silence that followed was total. Doyle's coffee cup stopped 8 inches from his mouth and stayed there suspended, while his brain ran the calculation it had been running for 2 weeks and arrived at a different answer than it had been getting. He looked across the bullpen for Weston, found him immediately. Weston's face was already the color of old copy paper, and he was gripping the edge of his desk like the floor was tilting. Doyle crossed the room to him and delivered the survival script in a low, tight voice. Routine debrief, some paperwork on the Riverside case. Birch would be there. Keep your mouth shut and let the system do what the system does. Weston nodded, but his eyes were doing something Doyle didn't have time to read. In the corridor outside interview room, a Birch was waiting, tie crooked, which never happened, a thin film of sweat on his forehead that the corridor's 68-degree air had no reason to cause. He pulled them both close and ran the play. Deny everything. Demand union representation. The moment they move to procedural questions. Nothing sticks without my signature on the form. He believed this. He had believed it for 9 years, and it had always been true. The door opened. The room was not set up for a debrief. The table had been pushed against the far wall, clearing the center, an arrangement that turned the space into something that felt less like a conference room and more like a place where verdicts are delivered. There were no chairs in a casual arrangement. There was no coffee. There were 3 people standing, and the geometry of how they were standing made it immediately clear who held the authority in this room and who had just walked into someone else's prepared ground. Chief Vanessa Carr stood in the exact center, her uniform pressed to a standard that made the rest of the building feel slightly unkempt by comparison. Her posture held the particular quality of a person who is completely at ease in a situation that everyone else in the room is struggling to process. To her right, Detective Reyes with a sealed federal evidence folder and an expression that was carefully professionally neutral except around the eyes. To her left, a man in a charcoal suit with a badge clipped to his belt that said something other than Hargrove City PD. He did not introduce himself yet. He didn't have to. Vanessa, close the door. The door closed behind them, and the click of the latch was a sound that Doyle would remember for a long time afterward. Vanessa introduced the man in the charcoal suit, Agent Carl Desmond, FBI, Public Corruption Task Force. Birch's chest puffed up immediately. Protocol jurisdiction, the proper channels, nothing comes into his precinct without going across his desk first. It was a speech he had given before in different configurations, and it had always worked. "You're mistaken about 2 things," Captain Vanessa said, and her voice was so quiet and so completely certain that Birch stopped mid-sentence. "This is no longer your precinct, and this is not an internal affairs matter. This is a federal criminal investigation. Doyle tried his voice, the command voice, the one that had worked in 100 interrogations and 1,000 street stops, but it came out with a crack in the foundation. We haven't done anything. We've been out there keeping this city safe. One look from Vanessa to Reyes. One nod. The monitor on the wall came on. The footage was 4K and utterly clear. The overhead angle from above the lift bay at Grady's shop. The timestamp in the lower right corner, the audio running clean and unbroken beneath the image. Doyle watched himself walk through Owen Grady's shop like a man taking stock of his property. He watched himself order Weston to disable his camera. He heard his own voice saying technical malfunction with a flatness that sounded different in playback than it had felt in the moment of saying it. He watched himself grab Owen Grady by the coveralls and shove him into the side panel of a truck. And for one brief, strange, nauseating beat, he watched it the way a person watches something they have never seen before, not a cop, not a man keeping order, but a bully in a uniform doing what bullies do when they believe no one is recording. Then his survival instinct reasserted itself the way it always did, because 15 years of not being held accountable builds the reflex deep. That's an illegal recording. Fruit of the poisonous tree. You need a warrant for audio surveillance on private property. Birch grabbed the lifeline. He's right. This is inadmissible. I'm formally rejecting this evidence, as head of Agent Desmond reached into his inner jacket pocket and slid a folded document across the table. He didn't say anything. He let the document say it. Title 3 Federal Wiretap Warrant, authorized under the Hobbs Act for extortion under color of official right. Signed by Federal Magistrate Judge Patricia Elmore. Valid for 30 days. Completely outside local jurisdiction, completely outside Birch's signature authority, completely beyond anything Raymond Birch had the clearance to touch or the standing to challenge. You're not rejecting anything, Captain Desmond said. You don't have the clearance to look at the paperwork. Birch's hand went to the table edge for support. Vanessa moved to Doyle. Not rushing, not performing, simply closing the distance until she was close enough that there was nothing between them but the fact of what had happened in that courthouse hallway 2 weeks ago. The height difference did not matter. The uniform on her body and the absence of one on his did. She said it quietly enough that it felt private, even in a room with 5 other people. 2 weeks ago, you kicked a black woman sitting on a courthouse bench because you felt entitled to the space she occupied. You thought I was nobody. You thought you were a god. She let that settle. If I had acted that day, Birch would have buried it. The union would have appealed. Owen Grady would be writing your envelope by Friday. So I let you think you'd won. Because I didn't want to break your pride, Marcus. I wanted to break your entire world. She turned to Weston. Weston was already crying, not the loud collapsing kind, but the quiet released kind, the tears of someone who has been holding something up for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. She offered him one chance right now, no delay, every shakedown, every falsified report, every time Birch signed his name to something that made a complaint disappear. If he held back a single detail, he shared Doyle's outcome. If he gave her everything, she would tell that to the federal prosecutor. Weston's answer came before she'd finished the sentence. I wrote it down last night. I have dates. I have all of it. Doyle turned on him. Don't you say one more, Vanessa. You don't give orders anymore. To Birch, the offshore LLC, the bank accounts the 20% kickback routed through a shell entity in Birch's wife's maiden name. Raymond Birch was not just a shield, he was a business partner, and the FBI had his financials. Birch opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His knees bent, and he had to grab the table to stay standing, and the man who had made 11 use-of-force complaints disappear over 9 years grabbed the edge of a government-issue metal table in an interrogation room and could not find a single word that would help him. 2 federal agents entered from the hallway. Birch was cuffed. His Miranda rights were read in a flat, practiced voice that made them sound like what they were the end of something. He was walked out. Doyle watched the man who had been his protection for 9 years disappear through a door and understood fully and completely, and for the first time, that he was entirely alone. Vanessa turned back to him. "Your badge and your gun." "Officer Doyle." Doyle's hands were shaking badly enough that the badge slipped the first time he tried to unpin it, the clasp catching on the fabric of his uniform shirt. A small mechanical failure that seemed in the silence of that room disproportionately loud. He worked it free on the second try slowly and set it on the table. Then the gun in its holster, placed beside the badge with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who knows he will not touch these things again. They lay there on the metal table, the badge and the gun side by side, and the 15 years they represented were visible in a way that had nothing to do with their physical weight. Detective Lucia Reyes stepped forward with the handcuffs. Her hands were not perfectly steady, and it was important to understand why not nerves, not hesitation, something else entirely. Something that had been accumulating in her for 3 years and had finally arrived at this specific moment with its full weight. 3 years of cold cases handed to her while decorated officers worked the assignments she'd earned. 3 years of watching Marcus Doyle walk through the bullpen with the casual authority of a man who had decided the rules were for other people. 3 years of promotion letters that said in careful language, "Not yet," every single time. She clicked the cuffs closed around his wrists, methodical by the book exactly as she'd done hundreds of times. "Turn around, Marcus," she said. The first name. She had never been permitted to use it. The fact that she used it now said everything about what had just fundamentally, permanently changed in this building. He was walked out of interview room A through the door into the main corridor, and the corridor connected to the bullpen, and the bullpen was at this hour fully staffed. Nobody had arranged this. Nobody had sent a message or passed the word or organized the audience. People were there because this was a normal working morning, and they were doing their jobs, and Marcus Doyle was walked through the middle of it in handcuffs, and 32 officers witnessed it. Some looked away, not in solidarity, but in the private discomfort of people who have spent years benefiting from a system built on choices they told themselves they weren't responsible for. Some did not look away. A few watched him the way that people watch something they have been waiting for without admitting they were waiting for it. Doyle's eyes moved through the room, searching for a friendly face, for someone who would hold his gaze. Give him the small signal that this was temporary, that the machinery would kick in and correct the situation, the way the machinery had always corrected situations. He found nothing. Tommy Weston was not in the room. He was 2 floors up, notebook open, on a table talking steadily to Agent Desmond, not stopping, not qualifying, giving everything he had written down in the small hours of Tuesday night. As Doyle passed the row of lockers near the exit, he saw that the photograph of the outgoing chief, the one that had been hanging by one piece of tape half removed, leaning at an angle against the concrete for weeks, was gone. Someone had thrown it away that morning. His locker was the next one down. He did not look at it. Outside, a federal transport vehicle was waiting, not one of the department's cruisers, not anything with a Hargrove City seal. Federal transport. A distinction that was not subtle and that Doyle understood completely. She stood in the doorway of interview room A and watched the vehicle pull away from the curb and disappear into the morning traffic of Hargrove City. And then she stood there a moment longer, because she had earned the moment and she was going to take it. She reached down and rubbed her shin. The bruise had been fading for days, and there was barely any tenderness left, but the gesture was not about physical memory. It was about her father, and about every person who had ever been told by the shape of a boot, or the tone of a voice, or the indifference of a system that they did not belong in the space they occupied. She thought about Dante Harris, 23 years old, 18 months of warehouse supervisor, 4 days in county on a charge that should never have been filed, a job, gone health insurance, gone a complaint process he had correctly identified as pointless. His name was on her notepad upstairs, still underlined. Detective Reyes appeared beside her in the doorway. They stood together for a moment without speaking, which was its own complete conversation. Then Reyes. "What happens now, Vanessa?" "Now we do the part nobody sees." She turned back inside. The morning was still going. The work was still there. There was always more work. 8 months had passed between the morning of interview room A and the morning of the federal courtroom, and those 8 months had done to Marcus Doyle what unchecked authority had spent 15 years delaying. They had made him look like himself. He sat at the defense table in the kind of suit the public defender's office keeps on hand for defendants who arrive without one faded navy blue cut, for someone shorter and narrower bunching at the shoulders, in a way that made him look both diminished and slightly lost inside his own body. He had lost weight. The barrel chest had hollowed. His posture, always the thing that had announced him in any room he entered, was the posture now of a man who has spent 8 months waiting for outcomes he cannot control and has learned too late what that feels like. He looked like the defendants he used to look down at from the witness stand. There was a particular justice in this that nobody in the courtroom remarked on because nobody needed to. His attorney had pushed for a plea deal in month 2. Doyle had refused because some part of him still believed that a jury of his peers would understand the realities of policing in a difficult city, and that belief had been the final version of the same miscalculation he had been making for 15 years. The trial had been thorough and, in the end, not close. Tommy Weston had testified for 4 hours on a Thursday, reading from his notebook, not looking at Doyle once. He described dates, amounts, locations, and the specific words Doyle used when he ordered him to disable the camera, and his voice was steady in the way that voices become steady when someone has already gone through the worst of it and arrived somewhere quieter on the other side. Owen Grady had testified on a Friday, sitting carefully because his back was still bothering him, and he had described 3 years of monthly envelopes with the precise factual language of a man who has organized his memory around the necessity of being believed. He mentioned once that his wife had been in the hospital the night of the final extortion visit. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Raymond Birch had flipped in month 3. Facing a racketeering charge that carried its own significant weight, he had given the FBI the financial records 9 years of Doyle's collections, the offshore routing the shell account structure, and in exchange received a sentence that was still substantial, but not the rest of his life. The 4K footage from Grady's shop was played 3 times during the trial. On the third viewing, 2 members of the jury cried. Judge Margaret Okafor was in her late 50s and had been on the federal bench for 12 years and had the reputation of a person who does not traffic in theater in either direction. No compassion performances, no severity performances, just the considered weight of what the facts support. She looked at Doyle over her reading glasses, and the courtroom was completely quiet. In the second row of the gallery, Vanessa Carr sat with her portfolio in her lap, taking notes exactly as she had sat in the Monroe County Courthouse hallway 8 months ago when a man who thought she was nobody had kicked her to the floor. The judge said what needed to be said. He had been given a badge to protect people, and he had used it to terrorize them, and he had operated under the belief that the uniform was a permanent shield against accountability, and this courtroom was the answer to that belief. 144 months, 12 years federal custody, pension stripped and liquidated proceeds directed to Owen Grady and 6 other business owners Doyle had extorted over his career. As the marshals approached, Doyle was made to stand and face the gallery. His eyes found Vanessa Carr. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She gave him a single, slow nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a completed transaction, and then she closed her portfolio, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom. She had a department to run. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, 6 other business owners from Doyle's patrol route came forward through a new anonymous reporting channel that Vanessa's office had established specifically to make that kind of conversation possible. Owen Grady had opened a door, and other people walked through it. Dante Harris, 23 years old. The name on the underlined notepad received a formal letter of exoneration and a direct phone call from the chief's office, which he answered on the second ring with the wary tone of someone who has learned to expect nothing from official numbers. The call was brief and factual and left him sitting at his kitchen table for a long time afterward, not entirely sure what to do with the feeling that something had been given back. The warehouse job was gone. The months were gone. But the letter mattered in ways that were harder to put into words and no less real for that. Tommy Weston resigned from the force 3 weeks after sentencing and did not contest the resignation. And at 27 years old, he had the specific uncrowded quality of a person who has reached a hard clearing and is figuring out what to build there. Detective Lucia Reyes was promoted to captain and took over a restructured internal affairs division with a direct reporting line to the chief's office, not to the chain Birch had spent 9 years cultivating, but a new one built from scratch. 3 months after the sentencing, Vanessa walked through the Monroe County Courthouse again. Same corridor, same fluorescent hum, same linoleum floor that still smelled of something older than the cleaning products trying to cover it. She was there for a routine budget filing. Nothing significant. The hallway was its usual Tuesday morning press of people, and she was moving through it when she saw a young officer new enough that she didn't yet know his name carrying a stack of files down the center of the corridor. A civilian on a bench had his feet slightly extended into the walkway. The officer stopped. He looked at the man on the bench. He smiled an actual uncomplicated human smile, stepped to the right to give the man more room, and said, "Sorry about that. You have a good morning." Then he kept walking. Vanessa watched this happen and did not stop walking either, but she let herself have the moment, the quiet, real, unglamorous thing that genuine change looks like when it finally takes hold in a place not as a dramatic gesture, but as an ordinary Tuesday. That evening she was at her desk by 7, which was normal. The city lights beginning to come on outside the window, the next budget cycle already in the inbox. On the corner of her desk, half buried under a stack of case files, was the notepad page with Dante Harris's name written on it and underlined from that midnight 8 months ago when she had been up reading his file and had written his name down and made a quiet promise to herself. She hadn't thrown it away. She picked it up, read the name one more time, and put it back beneath the files. The bruise on her shin had been gone for months. The work was still here. It was always still here. She put on her reading glasses and started on the next page. If this story moved you, if you believe that nobody who carries a badge is above the real meaning of that badge, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Justice doesn't always make the front page, but when it comes, it is worth every word.